a diagram developed with directors of finance in councils that more or less says where we are going is totally unsustainable. The hard lines, red and blue, are where we thought we were until the Chancellor's autumn statement last November. George Osborne's little gift to us is we think the demand line will increase more rapidly as a consequence of welfare reform and its impacts on communities in Scotland. And it's pretty clear from his statement that there will be another round of about 20 billion of expenditure cuts in 2014-15. In the UK, you'd expect about 2 billion of that would come down line to Scotland. So the rate at which demand will grow, the way we currently deal with demand, will be completely out of kilter with what's happening to the resource base we will have available to address that. And I think the key message that's been taken out of that is the problem here is not predominantly income, the problem here is predominantly demand. An awful lot of that line is about our need to react to extraordinarily negative things that will happen in the lives of households and communities across the next period, because we will not have organised ourselves to prevent those things happening. So if you take one message out of this, it is where the government's current very strong agenda about a shift to prevention is coming from. If we cannot shift to preventing very negative things happening to people, we will end up heaving money at them retrospectively, but we will not have the money available to us to do that if you look forward. So that's first driver of change thought across the last 2 years. The second one is work that we did in support of the Christie Commission, and that was to just take a very hard look, if you look across the whole of Scotland, how are we living? Is there one Scotland, as the strapline for our government went for the last 5 years? And really what that diagram shows you is the way in which, at a very local level, communities of 600 to 1,000 people, 7,000 of them across Scotland, things cluster. And what it shows is, if you do badly in one dimension of life, you're almost certainly doing badly in other related dimensions of life. And equally, in Scotland, if you do well in one dimension of life as a community, you will almost certainly do very well in other dimensions of life. What it's showing you is that the kids who are failing in education have parents who are unemployed, suffering income deprivation, enjoy very poor health, are highly likely to have drugs and alcohol problems, and so on and so forth. That these things are not happening in isolated packages we can deal with service by service. These things are happening to whole communities. And negative outcomes are very clustered at community level, so also are positive outcomes. At the top end for Scotland, we have people who have lives, incomes, health that is exemplary by any international standards. They would rival anything that's happening in Sweden and other Scandinavian countries, in France or in Germany. These people are living lives of utter excellence in terms of global comparisons. At the other end, we have people who are living lives that are more akin to parts of the developing world than the developed world of Europe. And the gap between the top and the bottom in Scotland is very much more pronounced than for any other European country. These are just a few indicators at S4 level, emergency admissions. But if you take the 100 most disadvantaged communities in Scotland and the 100 most advantaged communities in Scotland, it is a fabulously stark contrast you're drawing in the way people are living and the opportunities they have in life. And I think the review of community planning, which is being led by COSLA and Scottish ministers at the present moment, which we are supporting in the Improvement Service, ministers are very clear that is intolerable. That is utterly unacceptable. And therefore, as we go forward, a community plan that doesn't clearly identify the nature and scale of the inequalities within an area and then propose mechanisms for reducing them will be utterly unacceptable to them as ministers. It will not be a community plan, it will not be an SOE. So we have got to a point, I think, through both the financial pressures we face, but actually looking more honestly at how we live. So if you're signed up to an SOE in your area that says we will improve educational attainment in Clackmannanshire, Stirling, North Lanarkshire, who's interested if that's not about bringing up the most vulnerable children in the most vulnerable communities. If it's simply getting already advantaged children to further standard grades, it's a pretty hypothetical exercise in advancing well-being. So what ministers are saying is, we cannot carry on like this. We can't because we can't sustain the cost of it, but we can't because it's embedded injustice within our system. But what I'd also want to say about these three diagrams is they represent learning. Not necessarily the kind of learning you would want, but they do represent learning. Some of it is we've learned how you deal with vulnerable and poor older people if they have an emergency at night. We've learned just bung them into a hospital. But that's a staggeringly expensive way of dealing with the needs of our older compatriots, and one that would require us to build a new general hospital every 18 months if we carry on hospitalising them at quite the rate we're doing at the present moment. So we do need to unlearn certain things we've come to learn over a period when resources were freely available and therefore you could afford fairly inefficient solutions to social problems. We need to think, as Christine said, how do we use community learning and development approaches for kids for whom conventional academic classroom education is of little interest and very little salience? How do we still engage with those children and create positive opportunities for them in their lives? How do we engage with the learning that leads to the hospital admissions we've got? You'll know Sir Harry Burns, the Chief Medical Officer. Harry commissioned a bit of work to say, well, let's look at Glasgow, Manchester and Liverpool because they have equivalent levels of measured deprivation, but health and life expectancy in Liverpool and Manchester are still better than Glasgow. Why is that? And the answers are things we've learned as communities and as individuals. We have learned that the way you deal with stresses and strains and conflicts in your life is violence. So a big part of the explanation of the difference between Liverpool, Glasgow and Manchester is the differential levels of violence that we inflict upon each other. People have learned that if you're marginalised and frustrated in your life, best to get pissed or stuff yourself full of drugs because, frankly, it hurts less if that's what's happening to you. But if you treat those three factors, violence, drugs, alcohol, that explains the totality of the difference between Glasgow, Manchester and Liverpool. But all of that is embodied and embedded learning that we've done over time. So it's not just a question of, do we want to support communities to learn? We need to support communities to unlearn certain things as well that have become habitual and routine parts of their lives as they go forward. In terms of community learning and development, this is where I get into a kind of ignorance probably, so roll with me. But I think we need to be focusing our efforts and attentions where the outcomes are worst. Not exclusively, because there are also affluent communities that increasingly lack any social capital or capacity at all, and as they age, that will unquestionably come home to roost. But at the present moment, the urgent challenges are in communities that are experiencing highly clustered negative outcomes across all dimensions of their lives together. And how do we engage with that and transform that as we go forward? I've mentioned the Glasgow, Liverpool and Manchester thing, but what's interesting is the qualitative work done as part of that research found a correlation between the differences objectively between Glasgow, Liverpool and Manchester and community sense of confidence and capacity. So the building of confidence and capacity, a sense of value and a sense of worth is of critical importance if we're going to insulate and protect people. Yes, of course, the economy matters, stupid. But Dave's right, it's not all that matters. And we do need to look at how we respond to the economic challenges and stresses and strains we face just now. But that means perhaps deciding where we position ourselves. If I speak to community planning partnerships around Scotland, they say they often struggle to get DWP to engage with them. When I go down to London and speak with DWP, they say community planning partnerships in Scotland don't like us, they don't like what we're doing, it's not our fault, but it's hard to engage with them. But they really do matter. How they go about their business in the communities you also support will significantly matter to people's sense of worth or of being devalued and marginalised across the next period. So where do we position ourselves? Are we there to organise protests, which is one version of community learning and development, community capacity building and so on, or are we there to take some of the unlikable things that will happen across the next period, but mitigate as best we can by working with people, the consequences of that in the communities. There are challenges in that need thought through, honestly, I think, as we go forward. And the final thing I would say on this slide is public services and their voluntary partners are a community as well. I think we're about as dysfunctional a community in community planning as you could conceivably get, and actually applying some community learning and development approach to community planning would be an admirable thing to do. We often do all the things you'd be trying to help community groups get out of. So we sit at tables and are systematically dishonest with each other. We sign up to things we have absolutely no intention of doing whatsoever. We agree to people's faces and then undermine it behind them. All of these behaviours are inimical to having a strong and robust community of public services working together. So part of the challenge is how do you work with communities out there, but also I think part of the challenge is how do you create communities across public services that make them more able to truly serve the communities that we have. Priorities for me flow out of that analysis. My sense is that part of what we mean when we talk about community development, community learning, is a methodology. It's an approach to how you engage with people, develop their sense of worth, their capacities, their confidence, and so on. But yet within a council it will often look like it's a self-standing service block in its own right. There will never, frankly, be enough of you to deal with the issues we face across Scotland's communities just now. I need all of your colleagues in mainstream education, in social work, in economic development and so on, to have access to the skills and knowledge you have. So your skills need shared. One of your roles may be to advise other people about how they design the work they're doing with communities, rather than to see yourself as the only people doing that work with communities. So there's a bit where I think you have to decide, and this will lead to how you set standards or don't set standards. You have to decide what role do you have within the collective just now. Is it you do your own thing, sometimes in a way that's very challenging to other services, or do you get other services to be better at doing the thing that you know we need to do if we're going to take communities forwards? What we need is a public service that understands that to make things work for communities will mean we have to learn much more effectively how to work with communities. David and Christine are absolutely right. You can't wander around doing outcomes to people. The moment you start to talk about outcomes, you have to work with people to define the outcomes they want in their lives and then support them to get there. Christine gave, I think, very useful examples from North Lanarkshire around Curriculum for Excellence. There's a whole set of issues about seeing how we work with young unemployed people as a community and collective issue, not about them individually to be picked off in isolation. Ditto in how we support older people. My mother died a few years back and I looked after her. Prior to her death, one of the things I found was I could not get a balance with services. I wanted to look after her, but I wanted supported to do that. The deal appeared to be either we'll take it over and you bugger off, or you're doing it yourself. But I could not get it right to support me to look after, even down to very simple things. Can I have a class in how I lift and handle better because I'm hurting myself and I'm hurting my mother? We need all services to think quite differently about that engagement with households and with communities. Finally, there's a lot of brands and brand names out there just now. If I go into any health context, I'll be told about the assets approach. In councils, we talk about community learning and development. Other people in regeneration are talking about community capacity building. We are in great danger of doing the time-honoured thing yet again, that we take a very limited resource and fritter it all over the place under different brand names, different initiatives and so on. I think you need, as a community, to take a lead role here in stopping that happening and make sure that we get the max out of the capacity we've got, both in being advisors as well as deliverers of service, but also not confusing the thing with multiple brands, all of whom will end up working with the same communities anyway. So to end, you'll be glad to hear 3 points. I think where you are and what you represent critically matters if the strategy that government has agreed post-Christie and will come through very strongly and powerfully in the review of community planning is to work at all. Because at the heart of that strategy is we know how to work with communities so we can work better for communities. If we cannot resolve that and get that right, then none of the rest of the strategy makes the remotest sense anyway. So you are absolutely at the heart of the agenda that we're now defining. I think what you also represent is a need to rethink learning across life, and to see learning as not just an individual and consumerist thing we do at certain points of our life, but about the building of our capacity as both individuals and communities across the whole of our lives. And that critically matters if you want a stable and cohesive Scotland through a period of massive economic stress that we are already in and will continue for the best part of this decade. And finally, I think we need to work to rethink public services in the light of that. I'll leave you with a story. My daughter Thea goes to one of Christine's schools, Airdrie Academy, and is, along with a group of her friends, was chatting to me about how upset they were about the proposal that the 16-year-old should be able to vote in the referendum on independence, because they won't be 16 at the time the referendum on independence takes place, and are deeply pissed off about that. And rather brutally, the point was made to me by this group of 12-year-old girls that, well, you're going to be dead quite shortly. We're going to be around for a long time. Isn't it absurd that you get a say, but we don't get a say? And there's a fair point lurks around that somewhere. So I said, well, get off your backsides then. Why are you telling me this? If you're upset, you're all members of Young Scot, use the Young Scot website and facility and organise your own referendum. And frankly, though, it won't be binding. The one you and I voted won't be binding either. It'll all be sorted out afterwards. So let's not kid ourselves. But why shouldn't you, as 14-year-olds, have your say and organise it with your colleagues all the way across Scotland? You know where all the schools are. You can access every single one of them through the Young Scot website. Bugger off and do it and don't whinge on to me about it. Interestingly, was the response to that. 3 of them were enthusiastic, but one girl said, who's going to listen to us anyway? And I think that is a major issue we need to address if public service reform is going to mean anything. That we have communities just now who don't believe that. And I think the answer is not for to say to my daughter in a kind of patronising way, no, 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 it's always worth sticking in. If in fact her experience is it isn't, there's no point in my saying that. So the trick for us is to make it really matter. That the voices of young people, disadvantaged and marginalised communities do matter in the scheme of things, but it's going to take the skills and the value set you bring to the table to enable the whole range of public services to achieve that. Thank you.